G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.51. We need to talk about Paul. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I left the book of Acts with the martyrdom of James, son of Zebedee. We also saw Peter convert the Roman centurion Cornelius. At this point, about a third of the way through, Acts introduces the man who will dominate the rest of the book, the Pharisee and Roman citizen Saul, also known as Paul. Paul began as a single-minded persecutor of the Jesus followers, determined to root them out as the blasphemers they surely were. Just a few years after Jesus died, Paul had some sort of vision and transformed into Jesus' greatest proselytizer. Paul decided that he was destined to bring Jesus to the pagans. Paul preached to them throughout Syria, Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, and Greece, in a series of missions that spanned 30 years. Paul died as a martyr. In later tradition, Paul joined Peter as one of the two very greatest of the apostles. Paul looms large to us today because he is a major protagonist in the book of Acts, and because the early church decided to include a slew of his letters in the New Testament. In his own time, Paul was just one of numerous missionaries. Paul cites many of them by name, but not one scrap of writing survives from those proselytizers. They are just names to us. Thanks to the accidents of history, Paul's letters are the earliest Christian documents we possess. His first letters, or at least the earliest we have, were penned 15 years after the death of Jesus. The final editions of the Gospels were edited somewhere between 3 and 6 decades after the crucifixion. Paul's letters carry a further distinction. With the possible exception of the Gospel of Mark, they are the only Christian documents we have that were written before the cataclysm that was the destruction of the Jewish temple. There is one additional burden carried by Paul's letters. More by necessity than by purpose, Paul created a theology of Jesus, orders of magnitude more intricate and sophisticated than that laid out in the later Gospels. Paul's Jesus is nothing like the Jesus of the Gospels, the man who turns up at a wedding and transforms cigar ashes into bags of weed. Paul's Jesus is an utterly transcendental figure. Paul barely talks about Jesus' life on earth. Paul creates a cosmic theology in which sin and death, opposed to God's will, enslave us. Only by surrendering to the divine entity that was Jesus could we be free. And we surrendered to Jesus by being baptized and participating in the weekly Lord's Supper. By the time that Christianity was legalized, around the year 300, Paul was interpreted as Christianity's first great theologian, rivaled only by the author of the Gospel of John. Paul's theology has underpinned Christianity ever since. We have 3 sources for the life of Paul: his own letters, the book of Acts, and a few comments by some church fathers. Paul's letters provide us with scattered biographical details. Acts spends 15 chapters, more than half the book, recounting Paul's missions. Paul's relationship to Jerusalem, his missionary goals, and the content of his preaching are portrayed differently in the 2 main sources. In his letters, Paul often says things that flat out contradict Acts. Our task is to sort out what is going on. Paul spends a lot of time telling us that he is just as much a legitimate apostle of Jesus as the disciples. Paul castigates Peter as a hypocrite and puts James in his place. Paul views his mission as greater than that of the disciples. The disciples, after all, spend their time preaching only to Jews in the piddling Jewish homelands. Paul is preaching to the whole world. Jesus came not just for the Jews, but all humanity. Paul presses the case that Gentiles will be admitted to Jesus' glory. Paul's letters leave us in no doubt that he bitterly objects to any missionary who is not Paul. He reserves a special venom for missionaries from the Jerusalem Club. Acts quietly but firmly rejects Paul's opinion of himself as a super-apostle. The book of Acts admires Paul, but goes out of its way to deny Paul apostolic status. To Luke, the author of Acts, the disciples are the essential link between Jesus himself and the new Jesus clubs. Paul can never be a link. Paul never even knew Jesus. Acts portrays the Jerusalem Jesus Club, led by Peter and James, as the one source of truth and master franchise holder of the other clubs. Acts describes Paul as something like a hired contractor. Acts insists that Paul bopped in and out of Jerusalem all the time to report back to the disciples. Paul says he has visited Jerusalem only 3 times in his whole life. Most readers of the New Testament simply don't register the hostility between Jerusalem and Paul. That's because the book of Acts does a grand job of convincing us that Paul and the disciples are in perfect accord. Paul's rants in his letters just wash over us. Only when we pay close attention to Paul's letters does it become obvious that Paul has no love of Jerusalem. To whom do we turn for the good oil about Paul's life? His own letters or the book of Acts? Scholars say it is a no-brainer. Look to the letters first, then the book of Acts. Sure, each have their own programs and biases, but Paul's authentic letters are primary sources, written by the man himself. The book of Acts was written by someone about whom we know nothing, and it was written decades after Paul's death. The rule has to be that when the letters and Acts disagree, prefer the letters. What does Paul tell us about himself? He calls himself a Hebrew, born of the tribe of Benjamin, and circumcised on the 8th day according to the law. He is a Pharisee, zealous for the law. Paul uses a lot of Pharisaic ideas in his own thought, especially about the afterlife. Many Jews had no truck with the concept. Paul reminds us many times that he persecuted the earliest Jesus clubs. Paul is a Torah-observant Jew. Paul never says he has left his faith, although he does admit changing the way that he lives in Judaism. Judging from his letters, Paul's first language was Greek. From his description of his encounter with Jesus, we know he spoke Aramaic. Whether he knew Hebrew is a moot point. During his career, Paul says, he has worked many signs and wonders. He has been whipped, stoned, left for dead, and shipwrecked. Over his career, Paul has received extraordinary revelations. Now, in this letter, Paul refers to himself in the third person. Quote, 2 Corinthians 12:12. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it. but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person who was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat." End quote. Paul says that he supports himself as a manual worker on his travels, and he uses Greek terms that place him one step below the tradesman that the Gospels describe Jesus as. Paul is unmarried, at least during his missionary work. He has some sort of disability, which he never clarifies, a thorn in the flesh, as he calls it, inflicted so he won't fall into hubris. Acts adds some more biographical information, much of which must be considered suspect. The book structures Paul's life work into 3 missions, performed over 22 years. In his letters, on the other hand, Paul adds 2 other missions, one of 3 years to Arabia, and a 14-year mission to Cilicia in Asia Minor and to Syria. One of Paul's letters claims that he travelled as far as Illyricum, which is the old Yugoslavia. These travels are unknown to Acts and cannot be reconciled with its chronology. One item in Acts that is sound is that Paul, who had a good Roman name, also had the good Jewish name Saul. Paul never uses that name himself. You may have heard otherwise, but Paul did not receive a new name from God or Jesus or whomever. This is not an Abraham name change. The book of Acts just blithely says that this guy Paul was also called Saul. Acts tells us that he was born in the prosperous city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, near the border of Syria. Tarsus was not only a commercial hub, but an emporium of ideas. In Tarsus, travellers traded both their wares and their philosophies. The city was a cultural and religious crossroads. The great church father Jerome knew of a different tradition. Jerome flourished in the late 300s, when Christianity had not only been legalised, but mandated. Jerome was the man who wrote the definitive Latin translation of the New Testament, the Vulgate. Jerome tells us that Paul was born in Galilee. His parents fled to Tarsus when insurrections broke out after the death of Herod the Great. To refresh your memory about those events, rewind to episode 2.20, Herod's Heirs. Jerome must have been sure of his source to contradict Acts. After all, he had translated the book from Greek to Latin. If Jerome is right, and he almost certainly is, then he provides us with another tidbit, Paul's age. Like Jesus, Paul was born before Herod's death in 4 BC. That accords with Paul's description of himself as an old man in his last letters, written around the year 60. Acts tells us that Paul was a Roman citizen, born to a Roman father, and that Paul had a sister and a nephew. We have no idea how Paul's father achieved his citizenship. Acts confirms that Paul was a Pharisee and throws in a cherry on the top. Paul was a student of Gamaliel, the near-legendary greatest Pharisee of the time. We've met Gamaliel before, in my last episode, when he saved all the disciples from death. The book of Acts co-opts Gamaliel as an intelligent, reasonable, and open-minded Jew who can entertain the ideas of the Jesus clubs and of Paul. In Acts, the real villains are the irrational Jews, determined to destroy Paul and the clubs. Paul's arrest by the Romans at the end of his missions is not a misfortune. It is a salvation. Only Roman house arrest saves Paul from a lynching. Neither the book of Acts nor Paul's letters give us many chronological hooks. The best we can figure out is that Paul began to preach after the death of Stephen, and that was a year or two after the death of Jesus. Call it 31 to 35, depending on when you think Jesus died. Acts says Paul was in Corinth on his second mission during the rule of the governor Gallio, whom we know ruled from 51 to 52. Paul was later tried before the Judean procurator, Porcius Festus, whom we think ruled between 58 and 62. And those are all the dates we have. Acts leaves us with Paul in Rome awaiting trial. We receive a further morsel from the first letter of Clement. Tradition held that Clement was Peter's hand-picked successor as head to the Roman Jesus Club. Clement says that Paul was found innocent in Rome and travelled to Spain to preach the gospel. Then Paul's story goes to black. Some filled in the void by declaring that Paul returned to Rome for a second trial. Later tradition, without evidence, held that Paul died in the persecution of Nero, sometime around the year 62, a year or two before Peter was martyred in Rome. Paul's letters are nothing like the Gospels, the biographies of Jesus. We have no evidence that the evangelists knew a word of his letters. Yet the letters must have been circulating in Christian communities for at least a few years when Mark wrote his Gospel around the year 70, and for 20 years by the time the other evangelists wrote theirs. You might think that Luke, author of both the Gospel of that name and Acts, was well versed in Paul's letters. Yet again and again, the book of Acts contradicts the letters. Some argue that the evangelists were well aware of the letters, even if they betray no evidence of their knowledge. The Gospel writers, these scholars hold, wrote their books specifically to remedy Paul's indifference to the life of the man Jesus, and to bring Paul's cosmic Jesus back down to earth. Paul is shockingly ignorant about Jesus' life. Paul says that Jesus was a man, born according to the law as a Jew and a descendant of David. Jesus had brothers. Paul met one of these brothers, James. Paul knows that Jesus preached a new message to the Jews. He knows that Jesus had 12 disciples. Paul met and later clashed with one of these disciples, Peter. Just before his death, Paul says, Jesus established a bread and wine ritual for his followers as a memorial to himself. On the instigation of the Jews, the Roman authorities killed Jesus by crucifixion and entombed him. He rose from the dead, after which many people saw him. And that is all that Paul knows about the life of Jesus. Paul does not know that Jesus was a travelling preacher. Paul does not know that Jesus was a prolific teacher. Paul knows nothing of the many parables. Nor does Paul know that Jesus was a healer and a miracle worker. Paul boasts that he himself performed signs and wonders. Paul does not know that Jesus did. Paul never mentions John the Baptist. Paul does not know the Lord's Prayer. Paul never mentions any of the details of the Passion story that we know so well. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, the arrest at Gethsemane, the trials before the council and Pilate, Jesus' anguish on the cross. Why doesn't Paul talk about Jesus' life in his letters to his clubs? Surely the Jesus clubs that he founded would have hankered for stories about Jesus. Why does Paul so rarely mention Jesus' time on earth? One idea is that Paul knew quite a lot about the life of Jesus. He never mentioned anything because his clubs already knew the life of Jesus. Paul had no need to reprise familiar tales. There is a problem with that theory. Paul spills endless amounts of ink, correcting his clubs when they misunderstand him. All these corrections concern Paul's theological views about the significance of Jesus' resurrection, about the world to come, about the relative status of Jews and Gentiles. Paul never writes to a club to correct them about some fact of Jesus' life. And when Paul does admonish a club, as he so often does, he only 3 times cites a saying of Jesus to support his authority. The Gospels are chock-a-block with tales of Jesus welcoming those whom Orthodox Jewish elites shunned: Samaritans, sex workers, tax collectors, the poor. Paul could have drawn on innumerable anecdotes to support his own mission to the Gentiles, which was proceeding against the objections of Peter and James. But he does not. A second theory agrees that Paul was well aware of Jesus' biography. But Paul considered Jesus' time on earth as irrelevant to his mission. Paul's Jesus was a celestial figure. Who cared that the Son of Heaven preached in this town then and that town next? Why bother to discuss the Son of God's choice of footwear? Paul is fixated on Jesus' resurrection and its cosmic implications for the world. The same objection applies to this second theory. Even if Paul was utterly uninterested in Jesus' biography, surely his clubs must have asked him for gossip about this man that Paul was obsessed with. And surely Paul would have answered some of their questions in his letters. A third theory is that Paul's pagan audience didn't care less about the life of Jesus. The pagans had no interest in some executed Jewish rebel. They barely knew where the backwater region of Judea was. They asked no questions about the life of Jesus. Paul was hard-pressed to explain to pagans why the Saviour of the world had to be a Jew, so he never tried. Jesus' biography and the circumstances of his death interested no Gentile. So Paul simply identified Jesus as the pre-existent Son of God, the one to save humanity from cosmic catastrophe. A final theory is that Paul really was clueless about Jesus' life. Paul may have had a vision of Jesus, but at that event, Jesus neglected to fill in his backstory. In the few times that Paul visited the disciples, Paul simply let their tales of Jesus' life wash over him. He didn't care. Paul was the first to launch a systematic campaign to bring Jesus' message to the Gentiles. The Gospels drop a few hints that Jesus' rejection by the Jews prefigures his acceptance by the pagans. They strain to make their point. Jesus meets 3 pagans in his whole life. Perhaps the martyred Stephen believed in a Gentile mission. In a rather sad demonstration, Peter had converted one single family. Paul was the first to campaign on the platform that all had a home under God's kingly rule, not just the Jews. Paul was opposed by the entirely Jewish Jerusalem Jesus Club, led by James, the brother of Jesus, and his indecisive lieutenant, the disciple Peter. Peter and James did not approve of Gentile applicants to their club. Conservative Jews were revolted by Hellenistic ways. James and Peter feared that any mission to the pagans risked contaminating their club with disgusting and unholy practices. Paul's mission to the pagans inevitably collided with the Jerusalem Club's mission to the diaspora Jews. They preached in the same cities in the eastern Mediterranean: Antioch, Ephesus, Tarsus, Corinth, Thessalonica. Paul repeatedly complains that the clubs that he has so painstakingly founded are being corrupted by other preachers from the Jerusalem Club. The book of Acts ignores this conflict. Paul's letters show that the struggle was very real, and the central conflict in the Jesus Clubs, in the generation after the crucifixion. The crux of the battle is the status of pagans. To gain admission to a Jesus Club, do pagans have to follow Jewish law or not? Apart from the book of Acts, Paul's letters are the only New Testament documents that depict a Christian missionary in action. His letters show us a sharp and observant mind and reveal a fine writer. This guy is smart. On the minus side, the letters portray a willful, determined authoritarian. Paul knows he is right in every possible way. To challenge Paul's will is to challenge God's. Paul often harshly berates his foundations for listening to other preachers. According to the book of Acts, Paul follows the same practice in all his missions. In each new town he visits, he invariably begins in a local synagogue. Acts emphasizes that Paul preaches to the Jews first. Paul never turns away from the Jews. Only when he is rejected does Paul speak to the Gentiles. That's not what Paul's letters say. In the letters, Paul never indicates that he preaches to Jews before Gentiles. Paul's letters do provide other hints of his modus operandi. When Paul arrives in a town, he opens a leatherworking business in the city. Paul often tells us that he always pays his own way. He never mooches off friends. Paul uses his business as an opportunity to preach the teaching of Jesus to his customers. He converts a few people, who then bring their families and friends into the Jesus Club. Paul is no big tent preacher making speeches to the masses. Paul addresses family groups of Gentiles in his workshop, in private homes or a rented hall. Once the club is up and running, Paul closes shop and moves on to the next town, and he does this for 30 years. Paul maintains tabs on his old clubs through a network of friends and a stream of letters. Typically, Paul writes to a club in yet another mess and corrects them on their practices and faith. He often throws in a warning not to listen to other missionaries. By the late 1st century, a few decades after his death, Paul's letters circulated as exemplars of Christian missionary work, but not much more. A century after that, Paul was reinterpreted as a theologian and enlisted in the struggle to define orthodox belief. I'll tackle that fascinating story in my third and final season. Paul's theology eventually became the bedrock of Christian belief. Paul believed that he was living in a very special period, the short interregnum between Jesus' first coming and the end of the world. Paul's mission was to save everyone on earth from the impending catastrophe. Paul introduced a slew of distinctive ideas. Paul was preoccupied with sin and death. The Jews of his time defined a sin as breaking one of God's commandments. Paul had a quite different cosmic view of sin. To sin was not to break a divine law, but to submit to a transcendent evil. Sin was a demonic force opposed to God. Sin came into the world with Adam's transgression in the Garden of Eden. Humans were enslaved to the demonic force of sin. They were helpless to do otherwise. All of humanity was in thrall to a celestial power opposed to God's will. On the one hand, the Jews had been duped into believing that all they had to do to escape this power was to adhere to some silly rules. On the other hand, the Gentiles were willfully ignorant of their peril. Nor did Paul regard death as simply the final event of a person's life. Death followed from sin. Enslavement by sin led to death's conquest. Humans were powerless to save themselves from sin and death, until Jesus died for our sins and rose from the dead. Jesus defeated sin at his crucifixion, and he defeated death by his resurrection. But God had freely offered to all humans, Jew or pagan, deliverance from their dire entrapment. We ordinary folk could partake in Jesus' victory over the cosmic forces. How? By baptism. Paul invented the sacraments of baptism and the weekly bread and wine ceremony, the Eucharist. The Gospel writers knew these as events in the life of Jesus, not sacraments. Paul transformed baptism into the crucial ritual that allowed us to participate in Jesus' victory over sin and death. At the moment of baptism, the celebrant became united with Christ and freed from the dominion of death. In the Gospels, the Last Supper is a parting of friends. Paul turned that into a memorial ritual that Christians should use until Jesus returns. In the Eucharist, Christians enter into communion with Jesus and each other. This union is no simple metaphor. Paul believed that the Jesus clubs participate in the risen Lord as one corporate body in a mystical union with Jesus. That's rather similar to the Jewish belief in the corporate personality of the Jews and to their contract with God. The church, said Paul, is not a mere association. The church is a living organism in union with God. To Paul, Christian living was not a private matter. Jesus saves a people, not individuals. You cannot accept Jesus and then retreat to some hidey hole. You can only accept Jesus if you join the Christian body corporate, the Jesus clubs. There is nothing like this theology in the Gospel. In the next episode of History in the Bible, I rummage through Paul's letters. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.